But the skeletons rattle on. Benedict XVI claims he was too young at the time, but that gives one pause. He was 14 years old in 1941. The question that remains unanswered is, since there was mandatory membership for youth between the ages of 10 and 14 in a group called Deutsche Jungvolk, which he never joined, why did he suddenly sign up to the Hitler Youth at age 14? Joseph Ratzinger claimed that resistance was impossible at that time, and thus neither he nor his family were morally culpable for just going along with things like everyone else. I find this a stunning comment by a man imbued with such holiness. Now, the family may not have lacked morality as much as they lacked courage, because with hindsight, we all recognize now the moral imperative during the Nazi regime. Many Germans risked their own lives in resistance to the atrocities in order to save Jewish lives. Morality cannot be colored according to how the greater majority of people are acting. Joseph Ratzinger was a member of the anti-aircraft union protecting a BMW factory that used slave labor from Dachau to make aircraft engines. And later he was transferred to a unit in Hungary where he set up tank traps and watched as Jews were rounded up for transport to death camps. He may not have had any choice but to be drafted into the military, but he likes to claim that he deserted. He became a prisoner of war, but that desertion didn't take place until April 1945, when the end of the war was within smelling distance. Pope Francis's circumstances were different. To begin with, he was already in his 30s, leader of the entire country's Jesuit order during the conflict when the dictatorship tortured, killed, or disappeared about 30,000 people. The skeletons rattle. A few things we know. The Catholic Church in Argentina remains under withering criticism for failing to publicly resist the military dictatorship, and in some cases, it even supported it. This stands in contrast to the resistance against dictatorships by Catholic leaders elsewhere at the time, notably in Chile and Brazil, with the result that far fewer people were killed. Jorge Mario Bergoglio never received support from liberation theologians because of his conservative views on both Catholic doctrine and the socialist-leaning pedagogy taught by liberation priests. As head of the Jesuit order, it is reported that he turned over 2 of his priests to the military junta. He denies it. But what remains factual is that he relieved 2 priests of their service and then told the junta that they could be found working in the slums. The 2 priests were picked up and were chained and blindfolded in prison for 5 months. Bergoglio claims he negotiated for their release. Might be true. But at best, Bergoglio has been characterized by historians as indifferent to the military dictatorship, and by virtue of his silence, endorsed the heinous crimes perpetrated by the military. Even as the head of the Argentine Council of Bishops, from 2005 to 2011, he refused to issue a formal apology for the church's actions during the Dirty War, greatly disappointing human rights campaigners. He refused to be connected with evil. In 1952, the great Jewish theologian Martin Buber wrote a book called Good and Evil. And obviously this was long before either Ratzinger or Bergoglio were on anyone's religious radar. Buber's observations, however, raised some troubling concerns. Appreciating that evil persons are most of all eager to avoid evidence of their own imperfections, Buber suggests that religious institutions and roles serve to conceal the evil acts while providing a maximum opportunity to scapegoat others. Evil people, writes Buber, tend to gravitate towards piety for the disguise and concealment it can offer them. It gives you chills. Evil people tend to gravitate towards piety for the disguise and concealment it can offer them. What a charge. I do not know, quite frankly, if Buber had in mind the silence and complicity of the Christian churches during the Hitler era. The silence contributing, of course, to the utter abandonment of the Jewish communities during the Holocaust. One can make a strong case, however, that the inherent piety of the churches can well disguise and conceal evil. In many cases it did, and continues to do so as we find ourselves reeling from the multitude of sexual abuse cases that destroyed lives, yet the offenders were hidden in a conspiracy of silence and or authoritative religious roles. So I'm trying to figure out in my own mind the relationship between a dark personal history and the implications for a new day. Wouldn't a person whose history was tainted by evil grow a new capacity for tolerance and become generally a more accepting person in a diverse culture? This is where I despair when I see vestiges of intolerance expressed by Pope Benedict XVI towards Muslims, non-Christians in general, gays and lesbians, and women haven't fared that well either. And despite the startling embrace of the poor by Pope Francis, a most endearing quality, combined with his insistence on a simple life, making him, I think, kind of the Ed Koch of all popes. He is still adamantly opposed to taking his ministry to a more diverse group that has been systematically oppressed by the church through the centuries. By denying the past, denying his past, he has not softened to the hopeful blessings sought by people today. A question that really applies to everyone is, how do we live with integrity in the present despite the looming dark shadows of the past? How can any reconciliation take place as long as we remain disconnected from our past? And I'm not talking forgiveness here, just a chance to regain a trusting relationship once again. By denying the past, disassociating oneself from the past as though one were above reproach, this only precludes a new trust from ever developing. How do we ever get on, the popes included? How do we ever get on with the present day agenda of mending relationships? You know, it starts making sense that one's own spiritual journey begins once we stop disassociating the past from our lives. By acknowledging our own imperfections, we can begin a new relationship with others. Martin Niemöller is an interesting case in point. Remember, he was the one whose poem introduced our meditation this morning, where his quiet complicity ended with the chilling effect that when they came for me, there was no one left to object. Well, Niemöller began his own efforts at reconciliation during a 1963 television interview in West Berlin. Now, don't forget, he was a Protestant minister. He was sort of active in the resistance movement. He was in a concentration camp for 7 years. And still, in that interview in 1963, he acknowledged and made a statement regretting his own anti-Semitism. This then allowed him to begin anew and foster new relationships that were honest with the Jewish community. No one is morally perfect. The perennial struggle of good and evil may never change, but each of us is called into the responsibility of our own historical past. Francis and Benedict have shunned that responsibility. Niemöller did not. If our past is clouded with doubts, grayness, and obvious poor choices, then ought we not be even more sensitive in responding openly and lovingly to others? If we fail in that respect, fail to offer greater tolerance for others and a true openness to diversity, then the lessons of the past were never learned. Let me briefly return to Erich Fromm, who helps us understand the nature of good and evil quite simply. Good is all that serves life. Evil is all that serves death. Good is reverence for life and all that enhances life. Evil is all that stifles life, narrows it, cuts it to pieces. The skeletons of the past will not simply disappear. Pope Francis has a precious opportunity to show the world that our past, present, and future are inextricably linked, and that by denying past wrongs, we will never get to a present state of grace. We will never reconcile with what was and open new doors of trust, especially among those who continue to be oppressed. Piety cannot negate past sins. By avoiding evidence of our past imperfections, our spiritual journey will only continue to be stalled.